All right, welcome back to the garage. Chef Tush coming at you. We have in front of us a bare Triumph TR6 frame, or chassis if you want to call it. This is slightly surface rusted. It's been sandblasted previously and left unpainted. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to go over the frame with you if you are looking to purchase a Triumph TR6 or any Triumph IRS car. This would be a good opportunity for me to show you what areas to look for, in particular on these frames that can be troublesome. Or the second part of this video will be to tell you about areas that are normally modified on these cars to make them better. So let's get to it. All right, if you're purchasing a TR6, you're obviously not going to be able to see the bare frame as it is laid out before you. There's of course going to be a body on top of it for starters. And of course it's going to be on its wheels. You're going to have to climb underneath of it with a flashlight and probably a pick to check the areas that we're going to talk about. So that's the first understanding, is that you'll be looking at this frame from the underside of a car while it's laying on your back, or hopefully maybe if you're lucky it's up on a lift. So you're going to be looking more to the bottom side of this frame as opposed to looking down upon the top. Having said that, we'll still be able to investigate some areas from the top side that you'll be able to see from the bottom side, and I'll be able to show you them a little bit more clearly from the top side before we flip the frame over for you to look at the bottom. For the TR6, there was two different frames. There's an early frame from 1969 up until 1973 that has a few minor differences in the frame, and we'll talk about those so you can identify the frame, because some of these cars have had frame swaps, and you might have a earlier frame on a later car or vice versa. So you just maybe want to be able to identify that. So we'll go over the frame changes over those 2 years. I should also mention that this frame is shared with the TR250. Actually, the earlier TR6 frame and the TR250 are the same frame. And this frame, although different from the earlier IRS TR4A cars, it also shares some similarities and some same problem areas, such as the trailing arm pickup points. So again, I'm not a Triumph expert, but I'll, to the best of my ability, point out the frame differences from the early frame to the later frames. And there aren't many to pick up on. The two primary changes are here at the front lower control arm mounting points on the frame. The later frames in 1973, from 1973 to 1976, had some additional gussets or reinforcements welded in on the pickup suspension points on the bottom control arms. So that is one identifier on the late versus early frames. The other difference is the transmission mount on the earlier cars up until 73 again, that had an A-type overdrive. They had a different transmission mount versus the later cars from 73 to 76 that had the J-type overdrive, had a little bit different mount. As far as I know, the 4-speed transmission will hook up perfectly fine to both styles of mount. Doesn't matter what year. It's just if you have an A-type versus J-type overdrive, you may have to change or get a adapter based on the year of the frame you're using with the year of the overdrive that you're using. The A-type overdrive was available from, again, if we go back to the TR250, it was available from 68 up until 73, and 73 to 76, it changed to a J-type overdrive. All right, so if you're in the market to buy your first Triumph TR6 or Triumph TR250, if you're lucky, then you need to know the weak points on this chassis. All right, the first critical area that you need to check on any IRS framed Triumph are these box sections in the rear here that hold the rear control arms. And you can see that this one has definitely seen better days. This box section actually has stiffeners on the inside that keep the box section from collapsing. So the trailing arms attach here, run outboard towards the rear of the car. Here's the differential carrier here for reference. So if these areas are bad, are soft, and are rusted out, you run the risk of losing your trailing arm, pickup points, and of course that can be catastrophic. All right, we'll show you the back side of that box section. And since this frame has been sandblasted, it's pretty obvious you can see the areas of corrosion. Now, a lot of frames obviously have been painted, and some have been undercoated or have heavy layers of oil and grease on them. In that case, it may not be so obvious as to the corrosion. So in that case, you need to have a small hammer with you and a small pick to check this area to make sure it's solid before you purchase. So the next critical area that we're going to look at on this frame is in the center of the frame here towards the rear, and it is called, in Triumph terminology, it is called the T-shirt section for obvious reasons. So this is also known as the lower and upper cruciform plates, and your exhaust would normally run through this area down here. Your brake and fuel lines would run through on the chassis rail on the inside here as well. You can see obviously that this has seen better days as well with signs of corrosion. You can generally, again, you probably won't see them this badly since this has been sandblasted, and obviously a lot of this damage has been opened up a little bit. But if you see any bubbling, so in this case here, you can sort of see how this frame area is starting to bubble up. That's generally what you're going to see on a frame from underneath the car. You'll see some bubbling areas along this area here and along the sides of where the welds are. And if that is the case, you know that you've got rust under this plate, and it'll end up looking something like that once you start taking a pick to it or getting it sandblasted. And again, we'll flip the frame over and we'll look from the other side, but generally that's kind of what it starts to look like. It starts to swell up and starts to bubble, and you end up with something that looks like that. Alright, the next critical area you want to look at on these frames are at the front suspension pickup points, so the lower control arm attachment points. And what you're generally going to look for here, and again it's a little bit difficult if there is a body on the car and you're looking at this car from underneath, but you may be able to find areas like this, and you can see here, hopefully you can see that, where this bracket or this stiffening plate has become detached from this pickup point. So those are the kind of things you're looking for. Any fractures or welds that have broken, you want to see if this frame has been affected by any of those. So in that case, that would need to be re-welded up. In some cases, you will also see some fracturing in the actual bolt-up hole locations. In this case, I don't see any problems there. But you just want to make sure this area in general is solid. And again, the earlier cars will have less stiffening plates. We'll talk about an additional upgrade to these frames in the second part of this video. Alright, the third thing to look at on this chassis would be any visible rot to the actual frame rails themselves. And generally you'll probably see some holes. In particular, here's one hole here, again on the rear trailing arm location. You may find other holes along the frame, either on the top or the bottom. Generally I usually find more holes on the top, where water tends to lay on top of the frame versus on the bottom of the frame. So you may not be able to see these perforations obviously if the body is on, but we'll check for perforations along the bottom of the frame rails when we flip this frame over. What you may be able to see, however, are some frame holes in areas like here. You would be able to see that. This is the rear of the frame, and you may be able to find some holes running along the insides of the frame rails. So I would carefully inspect both the outer and inner frame rails for any corrosion along the length of the frame. In general, the centers ahead of the T-shirt tend to be in fairly good shape because the engine tends to leak a bit of oil, and that tends to lubricate the frame and prevent it from rusting as much as it would towards the rear of the frame. That's just my general experience with these old TRs. One of the other general areas you can check on the frame while the body is still on are the front and rear frame caps or frame ends. So in this case, this one's seen a little bit better days. It's had a little bit of abuse back here. I don't know whether that's the result of just a rear end collision or something else, but you can see there's a little bit of rippling going on here in the rear of the frame. There's also some corrosion in this area, so it's been weakened a little bit back in this area. You'll also want to do the same thing on the front frame horns, I'll call them, and see if they are square. They actually look pretty good on this frame up here, so I don't seem to see any issues up here with the front frame horns. Alright, we're running out of things that you'll just be able to visually see upon checking with the body on the car. One of the areas you may be able to look at are the locations here at the bottom of this strut that holds the front suspension turret. In some cases these are corroded or the welds have broken, so you may be able to see this a little bit. You'll have to look specifically in that area to see if there's any concerns on the stiffeners or strengtheners for that front suspension turret. One other area to look at on these cars, if you're looking at a car that's been fitted with a tube shock conversion that bolts up to the stock lever shock mount locations, is this area here. The frame has been known to fracture in this area on the rear differential carrier here and back in here and just on the sides here. This area has been known to fracture. With the geometry of the tube shock conversion, it tends to put a lot of pressure on this rear differential carrier, and it starts to want to make it sway back and forth if you don't have a brace. In certain cases, some of the tube shock conversion kits come with a modifying brace to brace it triangularly. That tends to keep that differential bridge from swaying and from cracking the mounts down here. Flip this frame over and look at it from the bottom side, and we'll look at some of those same areas from the bottom. Alright, now that the frame is turned over and the bottom side is up, this is the side you'll be looking at from underneath the car. Let's have a look at the underside of the frame. Alright, going back to the rear attachment points for the rear trailing arm, you can see that there's some corrosion on the bottom that you'd be able to spot. You'll also see again the corrosion that we could see from the top side here. And that is where you're going to want to take a small ball peen hammer or pick. If you can't identify that that's solid, you want to tap on that frame or take a quick pick of it to see if it's solid. That's very important. Otherwise you're looking into some serious money to find a frame or do a frame repair. These sections are available from the major suppliers to purchase, but it's quite a job to install them. The cruciform plate or the T-shirt section, you can see from the bottom, has seen better days, and again with the sandblasting it's exposed the holes here, but you can actually see here where the actual cruciform plate covers those side sections and the rear sections. Again, some more damage here on the rear control arm mounts. This is what it looks like when it starts to rust. You can see the bubbling there, and that's what you'll probably primarily see before you get to see something like that. You want to look for any bubbling rust like that. That's a good indicator that you've got bigger problems below. Again, same thing over here in this area, bubbling rust. Let's go up to the front area. And again, this is what you're going to be able to see from under the car up front. So the front suspension pickup points, and do your best to check these areas here for any corrosion or breaks. These ones actually look pretty good outside of that one piece that needs to be re-welded. Again, you're going to be looking for any holes along the length of the frame rails, front to back. Again, this looks pretty good for the most part. In the center of the frame, trailing arms, obviously, trailing arm pickup points we know are bad. Cruciform section is bad. And all the way back to this point, it's pretty good, but then you start picking up some rust holes here in the rear legs of the frame where the moisture has got in and sat and rusted out this area. So that would be apparent from the bottom of the car looking up, so you would definitely catch that. Not that difficult to repair if you want to repair that area, but obviously that could lead to other areas of inspection. If you see that much rust there, there's going to be some apparent rust elsewhere. One of the other things you can look for on this frame is you can tell generally how this car was jacked up in its previous life and where the jack stands were applied. In many of these cars you'll see that this front location here is used to jack the car up, and in many cases it's heavily dented. You may just want to have a quick look at that. If it's been used for a period of 40 years and being jacked up in the same location, the metal could be dented pretty severely and could be getting worn fairly thinly there. So that's something you want to look for. This one has a small dent here in the rear of the frame. It looks like it's had some apparent, possibly hit a curb there, so that's something that would be apparent from underneath the car. So just do a general inspection of the frame from front to back from under the car. All right, I just wanted to take a second to talk about an area of weakness, an area of known weakness on these cars that you won't necessarily be able to identify when you're looking at a prospective Triumph to purchase, but I wanted you to be aware of it. You may be able to identify it on a drive if you hear a clunk in the rear end. This is the possibility for that happening. All right, so this is definitely a weakness on all of the Triumph IRS cars. This is the differential carrier locations, and you can see the 4 mounting pins there for the differentials. Now, while driving, the differential will torque and put some stress on these mounts. And in most cases, your car will probably at some point in its life develop a crack in these mounts. As you can see here, this one is cracked, this one is not. The 2 frontmost mounts are more prone to cracking than the rear are, although I have seen some cracks in the rear, so they both warrant inspection. But it's more common to find these cracks in the front. Again, this is an area you won't be really able to inspect because the differential will be in the way. However, you may be able to hear this problem occurring while driving if you hear a clunk in the car while under acceleration. This could be one of the culprits. I say one of the culprits as there could be other things like U-joints also. So the good thing about these IRS frames is that they are fairly easy to be repaired if you have a certain skill set. If you can do a little bit of fabrication and you can do a little bit of welding work, then you are pretty much able to restore these frames back to new condition. So for those of you who want to take on the task of restoring an old Triumph frame, the good thing is that there are parts available to do so. The box sections are available from the larger Triumph suppliers. So the box sections for the rear trailing iron attachment are available. The upper and lower cruciform plates are available. As mentioned, there is a boxing, if you wanted to box in your differential mounts while you're doing your frame repairs. There are plates in order to do the boxing in of both the front and rear differential pins. As well as the pins themselves. All right, I wanted to go into a little bit further detail when I say boxing. What do I mean by boxing in the mounts? Well, by boxing I mean adding a piece of metal to the side, so plates to the side of this mount to tie this in more continuously to the upper differential mount. So normally there are plates that are welded in here. Normally they have some drainage holes from water. So that's what I meant by boxing, and again, you can do it on the rears and on the fronts. I did want to address one more area of potential upgrade, and that's in these areas here in the rear. I mentioned about boxing the differential carrier in, but these areas can be boxed as well. So this area in here, this metal actually is pretty thin. You can actually add a piece of metal in here to box this section in. I've seen people also do the front differential carrier, and they've added pieces of metal in here to box this section in. I've also seen people box this section in on the side and add a plate of metal in here to strengthen that area. So that's another area where people do some modifications in order to strengthen the frame. One more area you might want to consider is if you are wanting to strengthen these pins that hold the differential. They obviously go through the differential carrier on top. A lot of people on the top side of this area will actually weld washers around the top side of the pins that protrude through the differential mount, both rear and front. So you often see modifications done on the outside with large washers welded around the tops of these pins. Alright, I thought I'd give you a quick look of where those differential pins protrude through the top of the differential carrier. And here's the area where I mentioned that a lot of guys will put some large washers around this area and weld them in for reinforcement, not only here, but also on the rear. There are also reinforcement kits if you have an early frame and you wanted to add the later reinforcements. There are reinforcement kits available on the marketplace for you to upgrade your early frame or to fix your later frame. So one other thing I just wanted to touch on before I go, I do understand that there are other non-stock modifications that you can do to these frames to improve them, but I really don't want to get into them here. I did want to touch on the fact that I do know that some people do actually put some gusseting in here. For example, they put some triangulation in here in the corners of these frames in the bell section, as they call it. Some people have done some support for the differential carriers, and if you've watched my TR250 restoration videos, you'll know that I put some extra bracing fore and aft for the differential carrier. In my car. So there are modifications out there you can do to strengthen your frame. They are non-stock modifications, but I just wanted to point it out that yes, I'm aware that you can do some other modifications to these frames, but I didn't want to really put it as part of this video. As I mentioned, if you have the right skill set and right tools to be able to fix these frames, it can be done. I'm going to actually put a link up in the corner here to Elin Yakov's channel, his Rusty Beauty's channel, where he shows the complete restoration of a frame and has come up with some ingenious jigs to locate the rear trailing arm sections correctly when welding them in. All right, we're going to wrap this video up, and hopefully it's been helpful to anybody that's considering buying an IRS Triumph. You'll know a little bit more what to look for while looking under the car at the chassis. You'll see the common areas of rust as we showed in this video. Hopefully your frame does not look like this frame that we have in front of us. Although this frame is a rescuable frame, it's not a frame that you want to see under the car that you're going to potentially purchase unless you have plans to do a full restoration on that car anyway. All right, guys, hopefully this has been of some help. And if I've missed something, please note it in the comments section, and I'll try to address it on the next video. Thanks, guys.